Everything that gets into your brain affects your reality tunnel, your worldview, or your belief system, which I abbreviate BS. The three major things I've been trying to teach in all of my books is never believe fully in anybody else's BS. I don't care if it's Roger Nish, the Pope, L. Ron Hubbard, Al Gore, George Bush, or I don't care who it is. Don't swallow all their belief system totally. Don't accept all of their bullshit, all their BS. The second rule is like unto the first. Don't believe totally in your own BS, which means that, as Bucky Fuller said, the universe consists of non-simultaneously apprehended events. Non-simultaneously. The universe consists of non-simultaneously apprehended events, which means any belief system or reality tunnel you've got right now is going to have to be revised and updated as you continue to apprehend new events later in time, not simultaneously. This is the natural functioning of the human brain. It's the way children's brains perform before they're wrecked by the school system. It's the way the minds of all great scientists and artists work. But once you have a belief system, everything that comes in either gets ignored if it doesn't fit the belief system, or it gets distorted enough so that it can fit into the belief system. You've got to be continually revising your map of the world, or you'll lose more and more contact with reality. Anybody who has a belief system which covers the whole universe, that would be the Roman Catholics, Orthodox Islam, the Scientologists, PsyCop, the Marxists, the objectivists, and most of the assholes you meet on the street. What has happened is their brain has stopped receiving new signals. Or to the extent that new signals do get in, they all have to be edited to fit into the belief system. If they don't fit the belief system, they get repressed one way or another, like the doctors can't hear the baby screaming while they circumcise them.
That clip I just showed you was of Robert Anton Wilson. I'm going to start by talking about Wilson because he was not a philosopher in the traditional sense, and I think his work is much easier to understand for a mainstream audience than a lot of these philosophers I may mention. Wilson was primarily a science fiction writer. He had a doctorate in psychology, but he never worked as a research psychologist or anything like that. He became a cult figure when he and Robert Shea wrote this novel called Illuminatus while they were both editors at Playboy magazine. And how the novel came about was they would get these letters from all these conspiracy theorists all the time that they were going through as editors, and they concocted this idea that they would write a novel where every conspiracy theory that these people came up with was actually true. And that's where Illuminatus came from. And when it was originally published, it was published as 3 books. So you sometimes will hear it referred to as the Illuminatus trilogy, but it was intended initially to be 1 book. And the way they wrote it was Wilson would write 1 chapter and then Shea would write another chapter. And they just went back and forth like that, making a pretty interesting novel because they're always trying to top the other person. I don't know if they had any set outline when they started, but the novel is this interesting clash of ideas. The enemy or antagonist of the novel is the Illuminati. And the heroes of the novel are the Discordians, which is a religion that these guys didn't make up. It's a parody religion where basically the practitioners are a kind of anarchists. And they worship the Greek goddess of chaos, Eris. So when I read this book as a teenager, it had a lot of influence on me. And Shea went on to write historical novels, and I've never read anything else Shea wrote. But I read quite a lot of what Wilson wrote afterwards. And the book that had a big impact on me that he wrote that was nonfiction is Prometheus Rising, which basically outlines how Robert Anton Wilson saw the world. And it's also a good account of the anti-rationalist view that I'm exploring here. Wilson argued that you could separate people's thought process into what he called the thinker and the prover. And he said the thinker comes up with an idea or a concept or view of the world, and the prover sets out to justify that view. It's exactly the kind of anti-rationalist view I talked about in the first video. And a lot of cognitive psychology, which was what Wilson's background is, now says this is completely true. When you give people facts that contradict their worldview, they in fact become more convinced of their original worldview, instead of being convinced by facts. And that's how Wilson saw people thinking. And he said everybody's conception of the world is what he called a reality tunnel. And that nobody's reality tunnel is so big that it encompasses all of reality. So the trick is, if you are a person who wants to know what's really going on and what the real world is like, you have to be open to widening your tunnel as much as possible, which is basically the kind of stuff he's talking about in the clip I showed. It had a huge impact on me as a teenager, and I totally embraced it. It's not a relativistic view. When I would tell other people about it as a teenager and in my early 20s, they would always say it's relativism. And then I would explain it's not relativism because he's not saying there is not objective truth. He is questioning your ability to access objective truth and the limitations of human cognition. So that's not relativism. And I find like most of the philosophers who are accused of relativism, the argument they're making is basically closer to Wilson's argument than it is to any true relativism. And so a lot of people asked me after the first video about, if you can control the way you think, if you just naturally think a certain way. Wilson actually argued, yes, you do think a certain way, and this is the way. Everybody thinks this way. The trick is noticing that you do, because you can always notice when other people do it. But you attempt to justify beliefs you already have instead of looking at the world and arriving at your beliefs through interaction with the world. So the reason it seems that people think differently is because they start from different core beliefs, or they embrace different core beliefs based on things like identity, experience, upbringing, indoctrination, political affiliations, things like that. So it seems like they're thinking in a totally different way, but Wilson argued they're always thinking this way. I found it very convincing. And then when I was in my mid to late 20s, it started getting beaten out of me, especially when I went back to school, of thinking of it this way, because the academic world, especially in analytic philosophy, likes to insist that they actually have the answers. So that gets us into the discussion about postmodernism.
Quick, define postmodernism.
What it means is that postmodernism is a critique of what we assume to be real. Postmodernism argues that there's no absolute truth, and that the basic structures on which we've built our whole society are just social constructs.
Okay, so the Frankfurt School has this idea of, let's even go back for it. Let's go back to Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a philosopher. Oh, here's a bonus question. Why did Hitler hate Karl Marx?
I feel like there's a good punchline.
Well, it's not a joke, it's actually a Jew, because he was a Jew. And anything the Jews touched were
But otherwise they would have loved each other.
I thought they were a great guy. No.
So as far as defining postmodernism, which no one seems to be able to do, the best definition I can give for postmodernism is its works, whether in literature, art, philosophy, that question the assumptions of modernism. That's the best I can do. Almost nobody gives that definition. almost nobody calls themselves a postmodernist. I sometimes hear artists refer to themselves as postmodernists or using postmodern techniques. Philosophers pretty much never do. It's something that they're labeled as a pejorative. As all the people I will be discussing in this video have been labeled by certain people. But it's not a label they chose for themselves. And in fact, they're very different thinkers from each other if you get down to the nitty gritty of what they're thinking. So putting them in that little box, because they can't even define it in any way that is useful. So it's mostly pejorative. When somebody calls someone a postmodernist, especially a philosopher, it is usually a put down. It is viewed somewhat more positively in the arts, but in philosophy, it's definitely a pejorative. And I, too, had spoken in previous videos on my old channel about postmodernism in a way that was very dismissive in terms of philosophy, while having some appreciation of certain philosophers that would fall into that tradition at the same time. But it was mostly because I hadn't read a lot of it. And that tends to be what the people who are the biggest critics of it say. For instance, here's Noam Chomsky.
I have to say that a lot of postmodern work I just don't understand, so I can't comment on it. It seems to me some exercise by intellectuals who are talking to each other in very obscure ways, and I can't follow it, and I don't know if anybody else can. Postmodern views of science, by and large, have been pretty embarrassing, I think. There's some interesting work on this. There's a book by two physicists, Jean Bricmont and Alan Sokal. Both of them happen to be political radicals. Just running through, it's mostly Paris postmodernism, what postmodern commentators have said about science. And it is really embarrassing. I mean, to the extent you can understand it.
So I admire Chomsky a lot. That's why I put him up here, because the other critics of postmodernism who I could put up are not people I admire. A lot of them I think are outright just clowns. So I put Chomsky up because I admire him a great deal and agree with him quite a bit. His tact with postmodernism, though, is to simultaneously claim he doesn't understand it and that's a bunch of bullshit at the same time, which is fundamentally dishonest. If I don't understand something, I might say, yeah, this is very confusing to me. I don't really understand what's going on. Perhaps there's some merit to it, and basically be agnostic about it. But what he does is he just claims that it's bullshit. And there's, in fact, clips of him in interviews claiming that these people are amoral, that they are destructive. He makes claims such as postmodernists are isolating themselves from the common people and therefore are helping the status quo. The reason he does this is because Chomsky is a political radical, which is one of the reasons I admire him so much. But he wants to shit on postmodernism, which is really the most radical stuff out there. It's in terms of politics and in terms of ideas, they're doing the most radical work. So it's weird that Chomsky has such an aversion to them. And I just didn't find his arguments against postmodernism to be convincing because it's just a dismissal. It's an outright dismissal. When you look up people who are critics of postmodernism online and like who is the best critic, like people will point to Chomsky. But there's no real criticism of postmodernism in his supposed critique. It's outright dismissal and a bunch of ad hominems levied at sometimes specific people, in particular Foucault. Because in the 70s, Chomsky and Foucault debated. I have a book on this debate, which is a transcript of the debate, though Foucault spoke in French, so it's a translated transcript in his case, of their debate, an entire transcript, and then essays and interviews having to do with the topic of the debate afterwards. The interviews afterwards, Chomsky says tons of nice things about Foucault and about his thoughts. And in some of the essays, like he also, has some sympathies toward Foucault's view. He thinks they disagree on certain things, but somebody he supposedly respects. Flash forward all these years, and if you see any interview with Chomsky where Foucault is mentioned, he personally insults Foucault. It's not even that he says Foucault was wrong or just criticizes his ideas. He personally insults him by saying he was amoral and that he was, helping the status quo and like all these things. And I noticed that criticisms of Foucault become more aggressive after he dies. The kind of like shit piling on Foucault, like once he died, it's almost like they were afraid to criticize him too much when he was alive. Once he died, then there was just this complete dogpiling of what a complete shit thinker he was. Now Foucault, his major disagreement with Chomsky is Chomsky seems to believe that in terms of politics, as society has progressed, we have progressed rationally. A rational progression in our culture and our politics has led to more freedom for people and more rights and things like that. Foucault disagrees. He thinks that fundamentally it's power relations within society that matter. It's not reason and morality, and that these advances are really from different groups wresting power away from the dominant groups. That's probably a little too simplistic, but that's basically the disagreement between them as far as I can tell. I used to hold Chomsky's view, and now I find it almost an indefensible view. And part of it is just like watching recent American and British politics unfold. And there does not seem to be any rational process going on there. It seems to be a fight of power relations. So that's why I ended up on Foucault's side. In terms of that debate, now years later, the consensus is Foucault won that debate, which perhaps explains Chomsky's animosity toward Foucault. So basically, I now have more sympathy for so-called postmodernism because I started reading it, or reading the philosophers who have been labeled postmodernists, like Foucault and like other people I'm going to be mentioning. And when I read it, everything they said made sense to me. I didn't find it incomprehensible the way Noam Chomsky claims it's incomprehensible. And in fact, I found that what they were saying makes a hell of a lot more sense than any of the models I was given to try to make sense of what's going on in the world right now in terms of things like politics and science and things like that. None of those models work for me anymore because now I see the failures of them and that I'm more critical of them than I was before. So I was much more open to what these philosophers had to say going in than I would have been reading them previously. But honestly, I just didn't find it that hard to understand. One of the books I ended up reading, though, before I really started diving in was Postmodernism, A Very Short Introduction, because there's a series of books that Oxford University Press puts out called the Short Introduction series. Now, I bought all the series. I haven't read through all of them, but I bought the entire series because I read some of these on subjects that I knew nothing about, and then some of them on subjects I knew a little bit about, and I found them very useful. So I just bought the whole series, even going over like some of the subjects that I know a lot about. I tend to be less a fan of the ones I know a lot about because I'm aware of how it makes things a little overly simplistic when you write a very short introduction. But like I even appreciate the ones that I've read about subjects I know a lot about. The one on postmodernism is one of the worst things I've ever read in my life. It was written by Christopher Butler, who is a scholar of literature. It is the only book in the postmodernism or in the Oxford University series that actually attacks its subject. And I also got a introduction to Foucault that does the same thing. It's an introduction to Foucault's philosophy and history and ideas and attacks him. And in fact, at the end, tells you why he's not important. But it was even worse than the postmodernism series because at least the Foucault one, I think, somewhat accurately portrayed his views. Whereas the postmodernism one does not. Now, the postmodernism one, picking a literature scholar, he was not even a fan of postmodern literature. In fact, he spends the short period that he actually talks about literature arguing that that the realist novel is still superior to anything postmodernists do, which is something I disagree with off the bat. But he even does a bad job of establishing what postmodernism is, and even does a bad job arguing against it, since that's what he's interested in really doing. Same thing with art. He likes to present only examples that help him argue against postmodernism. So I was completely shocked by it. In terms of philosophy, he mostly just goes after Foucault and Derrida. Which I don't know a huge amount about Derrida, but I'm learning more about Derrida and becoming more sympathetic to him and his ideas. But already, like, I found, like, in terms of literature and art, his ideas are very useful. I already thought that before I started reevaluating. So I found, like, attacking him from a literature professor's point of view really bizarre, because I think that's where it's easiest to understand the value of Derrida and his ideas. So that was really weird. And then he goes on and only spends a very short section on postmodernism and science, which tends to be where the sore spot is with postmodernism, is the postmodernist critiques of science. So he uses one example, which is a paper that was written in the 90s. Emily Martin, I believe, is the name of the author, called The Sperm and the Egg. Now, he mentions that Martin is a feminist, but not that she was an anthropologist, which seems kind of important. But she goes through what she thinks are sexist descriptions in science in this paper. Like, just the language that scientists use. She thinks basically props up or supports gender stereotypes. So I don't see how this paper is, like, so outrageous, because it doesn't really undermine any scientific claims. It does criticize the way scientists talk about things. So it's not even really about science. It's not about epistemology or anything like that. It's just about the use of language and nomenclature in science. Portrays this paper completely negatively. I've read it. There's nothing like crazy in it. But this woman dared to say that some scientists might be sexist, and therefore she's portrayed as insane. in this book. Now, he does not mention Thomas Kuhn, who is extremely important to mention when you talk about these postmodernists, supposed postmodernist criticisms of science, because nearly every philosopher who has criticized science in this way is going off of Kuhn. So the fact that Thomas Kuhn is never mentioned is just bizarre. And I actually think the reason he's never mentioned is because then if he mentioned him, he'd have to argue against him, which would not be good for him, considering how weak a lot of his arguments are. He also does not mention some philosophers who came after Kuhn, who are really important and I think would be hard to argue against. So I had some familiarity with Kuhn from school, but it was always kind of just portrayed as this interesting counterpoint to Popper. And, you know, Kuhn has these kooky ideas, but it's interesting to look at these because it's interesting to question Popper's ideas. But, of course, we can't accept the things that Kuhn says. So that was more or less how Kuhn was taught in school to me. So I decided to reread the structure of Scientific Revolutions in order to make up my own mind about these things. But I always thought Kuhn's idea about how science basically progressed was right on the money. I thought that you couldn't look at the history of science and see it any other way. Like, Kuhn claimed that science, normally, what he called normal science, there's a paradigm. And the paradigm usually involves a theory. And we're in normal science, as he called it. Scientists are just doing puzzle solving in order to complete the theory. The theory is what it's supposed to look like. It's supposed to all make sense at the end. So what they're doing is just looking for pieces to the puzzle to insert them in. And because no theory is complete, they're human conceptions, you end up at a point where you get a crisis because a lot of stuff that you're trying to solve, a lot of the pieces that you're trying to make fit aren't fitting. So then scientists have to revise the theory, come up with new theories, come up with alternatives. And once they come up with an alternative, that's a revolution, like, basically. And then they establish a new paradigm and go back to normal science again. Looking at the history of science, that seemed exactly how it works to me. Is there's a point in science where they're like, we figured everything out. And there are some problems to be solved, but really all the big questions have been answered. And then something comes along that makes them go, holy shit, what's going on? Everyone panics. The older scientists hold on to the old paradigm, refuse to budge. Some young scientists latch on to some new paradigm proposed by some genius, or in some cases several people who are proposing something similar. And then after a while, the new paradigm ends up taking over as the older scientists die. It seemed very obvious to me reading the history of science. I took a course in school called the History of Scientific Revolutions, which was basically the textbook they gave us in that class. It just goes through the history of science, and that's basically what happens over and over and over again. So it seemed like Kuhn was right on the money. I don't know how you could read science and reject that. So I always had that idea. Even when I was arguing on a more realist position in science. Now I think I lean much more toward an instrumentalist view of science. Though I already kind of had some leanings toward that because I used to say, science predicts, it doesn't prove, which is basically kind of an instrumentalist concept to begin with. But I was very aware of the epistemological problems of science, even when I tended to lean toward a more realist view, a correspondence theory of truth type view. And now my mind has been changed. And the problem with Kuhn that I had, and seems to be a problem with a lot of people, is Kuhn basically argues that the new paradigm isn't necessarily better than the old paradigm. Whereas the traditional way of viewing science is that we're just progressing further and further. Like, there may be scientific revolutions, but we're just adding to the knowledge we already have. The knowledge we already have is solid, it just is incomplete. And Kuhn argues that even though it may seem that way, because that's how textbooks end up teaching it, and in retrospect it might look that way, but what's really happening is a total reconceptualizing of the old theory. If you keep things from the old theory, you have to reconceptualize them. So that's why he argues that when you go in physics from Newton to Einstein, which is the example everybody uses, they say Einstein's physics did not contradict Newton's physics, it just added layers to it. But he says that no, Newton's physics conceptually is very different than Einstein's physics, and you have to reconceptualize it in order to keep the things from Newton's physics into Einstein's physics. Before, I was on the side of the people who you're just adding knowledge. And yeah, a new theory might come along, but it includes everything from the old theory, so it's just adding knowledge. Now, like, the reconceptualizing thing is something that makes more sense to me. It was something that I just could not, I don't think I could comprehend it until I read his book the second time. And in light of problems I've had in understanding the way people argue and the way people interact and the way scientific knowledge advances. And what I find when I listen to people argue, and being on YouTube has actually helped me come to these conclusions, because I see people argue and I realize now they're using two different paradigms. An example would be the people who are arguing whether biological sex is binary or not binary. And I'm going to make a video about my views on gender and sex in light of some of the changes in view I've had recently. But now I just see there's a way that you can, in a totally biological context, argue, yes, sex is a binary, and it doesn't make sense that it's anything but a binary. But if you use a sociological paradigm, it fails every time. A binary completely fails when you're using a sociological paradigm, but works fine when you're using a biological paradigm. And both sides claim the other side doesn't understand biology, which is not true. It's whether that view is functional within the paradigm they're using and within the problems they're trying to solve. It was suggested to me that I read a philosopher named Paul Feyerabend. And I did. I bought 2 of his books and I read them. And not only did I find the things he was saying fascinating, I found them to be things that I myself had been thinking and saying to a certain extent for a long time. And I was surprised that anybody would be saying these same things within academic philosophy, because from my experience, academic philosophy is so against these ideas. And Paul Feyerabend, basically, if I want to explain his philosophy, he basically goes further than Kuhn and argues that there is no scientific method and his view is called epistemological anarchism. And he basically says anything goes as far as science. Now, this, of course, sounds very extreme and crazy to most people when they first hear it, and it's been strawmanned quite a bit. By anything goes, he means basically whatever works, whatever produces results, and he's saying that the great scientists are more similar to great artists. And there's a summation of Paul Feyerabend's views done by Sisyphus Redeemed that I couldn't possibly do better than. And one of the things that he says in there, which I thought was great, is he's saying that scientists who cause these revolutions, who come up with these revolutionary ideas, are like the Beatles, and normal scientists are like a cover band, in Feyerabend's view. And like that's perfect for how Feyerabend views it, I think. But Feyerabend is very similar to Nietzsche, which is one of the things that Sisyphus Redeemed points out, which I noticed as well, in that he will say things just to be provocative and to make people think, and he can come off, a little extreme, a little crazy, a little unhinged, but he tells you that up front, that's just like what he's doing. He's trying to make you question your thought process. So he gets accused of defending pseudoscience all the time, but the reasons that he defends pseudoscience is not because he thinks it's true. He wants to put it against people who have a view that they think is true just because it's supposedly scientific. For instance, he was known for defending creationists, but he wasn't defending creationists because he thought it was true. He wanted to see how people who believe in evolution and accept Darwinian natural selection react to creationists, which is the part I think is kind of fascinating, because when I see people arguing for evolution all the time online, they get it wrong. In fact, like when you see somebody who's an atheist who has a science channel and they're arguing for evolution online, it will be just so long until they make an argument that ends up being a teleological argument, which is not evolution, it's intelligent design. You have reached intelligent design when you start making teleological arguments. So it doesn't take most atheists long to reach teleological arguments if you watch these videos responding to like creationists or anything like that. They end up there. It's because they don't understand what they're arguing. They just believe it. And as Robert Anton Wilson said, belief is the death of thought. So I'm going to link the Sisyphus Redeemed videos because I don't want to go through Feyerabend's philosophy and answer all the questions that someone could possibly have about it and defeat all the straw men people could possibly have about it, because Sisyphus Redeemed does this for me. I can just link it. One of the things about Feyerabend that I find really interesting is he makes an argument very similar to one that I have made about scientists, going from Nietzsche. But he, in The Tyranny of Science, one of his books, he argues that scientists really just want to replace where the clergy used to be in society, where the clergy were the authorities, they were not supposed to be challenged, and that's where scientists want to be. And I think that is unquestionably true. It's something I've been arguing, if not directly, indirectly, in all my YouTube videos on my old channel. So when I read him saying that, I was like, finally someone else thinks this is true. Because in Against Method, he even argues that we needed separation of church and state because the church used to control everything. So we needed to separate the government from the church. But now science wants to take that spot. So we need a separation of state and science, which is it's one of his more trolly comments. It's a very bold thing to say. But an example of what he means that I think really holds true is they had what they called the March for Science as a protest against Trump, which was really like a protest about climate change awareness. It was about a protest of the gutting of the EPA that Trump was doing. Calling it the March for Science undercuts what it actually is, because people will say, "Oh, it's about science denial." I have arguments with people about this quite a bit. Like, what's about the denial of science? It's like, well, everyone accepts science when it's in their favor, and everyone denies science when it's not. They have psychological studies where they show liberals will deny science when it contradicts their ideology, and conservatives will deny science when it contradicts their ideology. So it's not a march for science. It's a march for the environment. It's a march against the greed of capitalists who don't care and want to ruin the environment at the expense of us so that they can profit from it. Now, reducing that to a bumper sticker slogan might be problematic, but that's what it really is. And by calling it the March for Science, you are actually undercutting what you are protesting against. Instead, you're trying to claim science as a left-wing value or a value against Trump, which I think is a mistake. It's a strategic mistake as much as it is untrue. And that's why I don't like that. I also don't like when people call people anti-science. I find calling somebody anti-science is just a slur, a pejorative. It means nothing. Because once again, while individual people say, "Oh, I don't do that. I don't deny science when it contradicts my ideology." The thing is, if a scientific study comes out and you don't agree with it, you can argue against it on scientific grounds. But your motivation for arguing against it is not scientific. So even if there's a flaw in methodology within this study, or assumptions made, or anything like that, you probably wouldn't see them in a study that you agreed with. You only see them in studies you already don't agree with. So I don't like the term anti-science. I think it's counterproductive when someone calls somebody anti-science. I also think that the people we call liberals, specifically neoliberals, are basically technocrats. Like when Bill Nye was on TV talking about Trump and talking about the March for Science, his arguments were specifically technocratic. He was saying, how dare you have a climate change denier on the show when all these scientists agree on this issue? Because one of the ways that I think that scientists are basically undemocratic and elitist and are actually proposing things that are harmful to our society is they want the idea that they cannot be challenged within their field. What they've decided is true. They don't even have to convince the public of it. And there are a lot of people, I never went through a period of arguing with creationists. That tends to be what brought a lot of people to YouTube, is arguing with religious people, arguing with creationists. I argued with conspiracy theorists. And one guy I used to blog with and talk about conspiracy theories with was a technocrat. Literally, he said, "I'm against democracy. I'm for techocracy." And I used to argue with him because he would say, "No, scientists know what's going on. They should be the ones making the decision." And I used to think that was an extreme minority opinion. And I thought that was really crackpot. I found it funny that he has that view that I considered really kind of goofy and crackpot, while we were united in arguing against people with these crackpot views and our opinions. But I realized that everyone has crackpot views now. even the most supposedly rational person. But it just amazed me that anyone could make that argument, because I don't want to give any group of people that power. So one of the things I noticed about so-called postmodernist philosophers is they're usually attacked very viciously with straw man arguments and ad hominem attacks. It happens to Foucault. It happens to Derrida. All the feminists. And it happens really horribly to Feyerabend. Rational Wiki's entry on Feyerabend is a total distortion of his views, and if you watch the Sisyphus Redeemed videos, which I suggest you do, you'll get an idea of what his real views are and see that how he's been distorted in the Rational Wiki. They do have a picture of him washing dishes, and the caption says, "Doing something useful for once," which I did laugh at. But I think what he is doing is very useful. But it kind of gives you an idea of how Rational Wiki's ideology works. They link as one of their links this blog that is this attack on Feyerabend, and there is basically the implication that he's a Nazi, which he was Austrian. And I believe Germany absorbed Austria when he was a teenager. He was 22 when the war was over. And he was drafted. And in his autobiography, he talks about how he really didn't understand what was going on. Because he was a kid, basically. And only afterwards did he understand. And the author of this blog tries to slander him by saying he's basically a Nazi. Because he was uncritical of what was going on in his own society when he was a teenager and in his 20s. Now, Feyerabend, would probably, if he was still alive, use that as an example of just you accept the world that you're born into and the indoctrination of the world that you live in. So I don't see how that hurts his points at all, but it's a really nasty ad hominem attack because everyone's a Nazi now. This is why I can't even label real Nazis Nazis, because everyone calls everyone they don't like a Nazi. So when you're saying that somebody who doesn't agree with you about philosophy of science is a Nazi, it's just meaningless at this point. So there's that there. I'm also going to link, there is this back and forth between philosophers of science with blogs about Feyerabend and astrology, because he publicly condemned some scientists, or criticized some scientists, I should say. Criticized some scientists to put out this open letter about astrology. Not because they were criticizing astrology, but because the argument they were making. Which I also agree with the argument they were making. It's very scientism argument. And Massimo Pilucci, who's one of the philosophers of science who got involved in this back and forth with philosophers of science on the blogs, points out Carl Sagan also did not like this. And for the same reasons Feyerabend didn't. So when you are criticizing Feyerabend for something that he and Carl Sagan agreed on, and calling him anti-science, you don't really have much of a leg to stand on. It's an interesting back and forth. As far as analytic philosophy, I think the views towards science that I now am leaning more toward make me understand analytic philosophy better. It makes me understand the debate over free will. It's just a conceptual reframing of the problem. I used to be a compatibilist in terms of free will. Now I see it as a semantic game that philosophers made up because there are two things they want to believe, and they had to come up with a way to preserve free will in order to believe them both. One thing was determinism, and the other thing was moral responsibility. So if you have to believe in determinism and you have to believe in moral responsibility, then you have to come up with some semantic way to make that work, which is what philosophers have done. Now I don't really have a view on free will, because I'm rejecting the compatibilist view, because I now see it as a con game. but I'm an incompatibilist because I don't think determinism and free will are compatible anymore. In terms of philosophy of mind, I now understand, I should say, the philosophers who say the problem's already solved, because the current paradigm is what they're defending. The current paradigm we use for neuroscience and related fields, and also probably physics that plays a part in it too, because some of these philosophers who are arguing that the problem isn't solved are non-materialists. So physics matters, but they're basically just defending the scientific paradigm. And the philosophers who are arguing it's not solved are questioning the paradigm. They're saying, no, the paradigm does not solve this problem. So if you look at it from a Kuhnian perspective, then you're seeing quite clearly one group is defending a paradigm, and the other group is saying this paradigm does not solve this problem. And it's exactly what happens in science right before a revolution. So I find that interesting now, but I'm like a lot more dispassionate about being involved in it, because it's like, yeah, it's a scientific argument. Science is going to solve this, either by accepting a new paradigm that is non-materialist, at least in terms of consciousness, or accepting a materialist paradigm that solves the problem. But I think the problem is that the philosophers who are trying to preserve the paradigm are actually arguing that subjective experiences that you have that may contradict their view of how consciousness works are not real. And even someone like Sam Harris says, consciousness can't be an illusion. It's the one thing we know for sure exists because we experience everything through it. So it just doesn't make sense to me to say like phenomenon people experience is a pseudo phenomenon, or there's some kind of semantic problem where people are talking about their physical experiences but are projecting things into them that aren't there. Because phenomenal consciousness, in terms of like seeing colors and feeling pain and things like that, like has its own thing. It seems separate from what the physical process is going on in terms of how it's experienced subjectively. So in terms of like acquiescing all this authority to science, someone who I think is very, very much an example of this is the YouTuber Gary Edwards, who I've gotten into quite a bit. His view on morality and science, I think, is an indefensible view. In fact, he semantically changes the definition of moral naturalism to be so broad that you have to be a moral naturalist unless you believe in the supernatural, which is a dirty trick. He claims that intersectional feminism is a form of idealism.
The experiences of a black woman are strongly emergent if they cannot, in principle, be understood in terms of their constituent parts. That is, if they are strictly inexplicable as the sum of the experience of being a woman and the experience of being a black person, requiring instead entirely novel properties, categories and relations of their own. If the lived experiences of black women are, as my intersectional critics charge, irreducible to a dual-track understanding of women and black people, then my approach fails. The first thing to note about this criticism is its assumption that first-person lived experience is what stands in need of explanation. That the job of any analysis of the oppressed and their plight is to understand the phenomenal content of their consciousness in the way that they do. This leap into righteous phenomenology comes with baggage, because as the study of the structures of consciousness, phenomenology is in effect a form of methodological idealism.
Now, idealism is the belief that only the mind really exists and that the physical world does not exist outside of it. I do not know how acknowledging that black women would experience things that neither white women or black men experience in regards to racism and sexism as being a form of idealism. That's totally nonsensical to me. He makes many arguments that are like that. In his videos about Sarkeesian, one of the more interesting things where he puts in the thumbnail the word Kunst, which looks very similar to the word cunt, and then constantly talks about her having a problem with her Kant in that video, but then says that he's making a play on the word can't, not the word cunt, but he undercuts that by choosing the thumbnail. He's either very dishonest or very stupid. He has gotten very upset when I've called him dishonest in the past. In fact, there's 2 videos where he basically calls me dishonest for calling him dishonest. But the only other explanation is that he is uniquely stupid. So that's why I went with dishonest, because I used to not believe he could possibly be that stupid. But now he has convinced me that he really is that stupid. I am reluctant to call people stupid on YouTube, but he's making the case for himself being stupid, is what I'm saying. I'm not the one making the case for it. He's saying that he's completely honest and arguing on good faith, so the assumption must be he's stupid. There's nothing else I can do. His videos are just bafflingly scientism, to the point where it's obviously harmful. It obviously makes no sense. I'm going to go over his views when I do my gender and sex video again. But obviously, what he thinks of as science is a accurate, complete description of the world. And that's why you can't argue with him. That's why it's useless to argue with him. That's why he can totally strawman Jessica Valente by just omitting a word she used, which is basically, which means in the simple terms, and say that because self-defense classes may help you fight off a rapist, that her saying basically focusing on women's actions having to do with rape is bad, is wrong. He's not only does he adhere to this idea about science to the point where it becomes ridiculous scientism, but he appeals to his own sense of reason and is so pedantic that it's just ridiculous as well. So he's a prime example of someone you cannot have a conversation with. So, speaking of people like Gary, I almost forgot. Another thing that people have done against postmodernists is try and get papers published that are nonsense in supposedly postmodernist journals. Alan Sokal, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, who's a physicist who was very critical of postmodernism, did this. But if you do research on the paper he got published, he insisted that they publish it without any revisions in the journal it got published in. And in fact, if you look at it, they published it specifically because he was publishing it under his own name. So his own reputation, they thought, was on the line. He was a physicist. They didn't do any peer review on it because they were publishing it as this physicist would like to make this argument about social construction in his own field. So we're just going to publish it as a item of interest, not really as an academic paper. This is used all the time to discredit postmodernism, but if you do any research on the actual interaction that occurred. It was not that they took this paper that was a hoax paper and just took it on face value and published it. They were given this paper by a respected physicist who was using his own name, who basically talked them into publishing it as something that would be of interest to people in their field about his field. It's very dishonest how it went down. It's very dishonest how it was used. And there is another philosopher. I hesitate to call him a philosopher. Named Peter Boghossian. He previously appeared on the Rubin Report and totally strawmanned the views of Peter Singer. And I didn't know anything about him, but when he talks about even philosophy, he sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about. Because he strawmans the philosophers he's talking about. He seems to be fairly right-wing, considering the kind of people that Dave Rubin has on the Rubin Report. And he's a regular guest. I would say that's probably a good guess. Occasionally there's people who aren't rabidly right-wing on the show, but for the most part they are. So he did a hoax paper, and he got it published in a journal called Cogent Social Sciences. And it's about the penis as a social construct. Now, even the abstract of the paper uses the term transgendered, which should have been a red flag immediately to anybody, because nobody uses the term transgendered. It's actually considered somewhat offensive to trans people. So it wouldn't have appeared in an academic paper. Now, Cogent Social Sciences, as far as I can tell, doesn't even seem to be like a real publication in terms of any kind of merit. It actually comes off as like a vanity press, because there's not only Cogent Social Sciences and there's Cogent Social Sciences, there's Cogent Economics, there's Cogent Biology. Like, it's an entire like brand, and their submission guidelines basically emphasize how quickly they can get your paper published. Not like a peer review process or any rules you need to follow. It's just like, give us your paper, give us the money to publish it, and it'll be published as quickly as possible. It's also not listed in the top 50 journals having to do with gender studies. Imagine how far down you have to be if you're a journal that publishes about gender studies and you're not in the top 50. So Boghossian, but however you pronounce his name, he got this published in like a journal that nobody cares about, and that it seems will take anything, and declares that as a defeat of postmodernism. Incredible. It's incredibly dishonest and just incredibly stupid that anyone would believe that.